Time to take a look at the pressure cookers of the Imperial Guard, the flame-spewing promethium machine that is the Hellhound. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be continuing our look at the datasheets in the Imperial Guard Codex, with a review of the Hellhound, the close support flamer tank that will cleanse your heretics and Xenos, even when they're cowering inside cover. In this review we'll take our look at its datasheet, any obvious buffs or synergies for the unit within the Guard Codex, and how I would personally use them on the field of battle. Now in the background, the Hellhound is exactly what you'd expect, a Chimera chassis variant that sacrifices the transport capacity for huge vats of highly flammable promethium. The Inferno Cannon is an absolutely monstrous weapon, reducing enemy infantry and vehicles alike to cinders due to the intensity of the scorching heat. These massive vats of promethium make the Hellhound an enormous fireball waiting to happen, so crews for Hellhound tanks are often drawn from punishment details or particularly unhinged volunteers, who are happy to bear the enormous risk of riding with a Hellhound for the righteous pyromania that they can indulge in. The Hellhound has some brother tanks, the Devil Dog and the Bane Wolf. The Devil Dog is a melter-bearing monster hunter. Squadrons are often tasked with bringing down the mightiest foes with the combined weight of fire of their melter cannons. The Bane Wolf is a similar version to the Hellhound that exchanges promethium for huge vats of toxic chemicals, inimical to all forms of life. So how would this trio of infernal canines perform on the battlefield? Let's see what their datasheet has to offer us. So Hellhounds, Devil Dogs and Bane Wolves are fast attack choices for Codex Astra Militarum, which is quite important as they can often be a decent choice to fill brigades, their main competition being Sentinels. Like many of the Imperial Guard tanks, they can be bought in squadrons of 1 to 3, and if you have 3 of them, then they set up next to each other and then operate independently for the rest of the game. At base, the Hellhound will cost you 101 points, so will the Devil Dog, and the Bane Wolf will only cost you 88, so it's the cheapest of the trio. They all have the standard Chimera pattern stat line, so movement 12, weapon skill 6 up, ballistic skill 4 up, strength 6, toughness 7, 11 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3 up save, and they degrade in the normal way. They're all armed with the turret mounted cannon. The Hellhound has an Inferno Cannon, the Devil Dog has a Melty Cannon, and the Bane Wolf has a Chem Cannon, and they all have a heavy bolter. So let's take a look at the guns. The Hellhound's Inferno Cannon has a 16-inch range, is heavy 2d6 that auto hits its target, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1. It has the advantage of being one of the longest ranged normal flamer weapons in the whole game. It's already quite a big advantage because not being right up and close to the enemy army means that it might be able to get multiple turns of flaming before being neutralised, either by shooting or close combat. The Hellhound in particular is a bit of a scary prospect to charge, because you can't just charge from outside 8-inch flamer range. It's always going to get overwatch if it can see you. Obviously this doesn't mean it's actually immune to being charged. There's multiple tricks that you can do to negate overwatch, such as charging from out of line of sight, or charging a nearby unit and then piling into the Hellhound. But it does mean that it's a little bit more problematic to charge than it would otherwise be. That heavy 2d6, strength 6, AP 1 is generally going to be strongest frying 1 wound infantry. The pip of AP means that it can still be fairly effective against more heavily armoured versions, like Tactical Marines for example. It will kill around 5 guardsmen a turn, if you are turning it on your fellow Astra Militarum, or 2 or 3 Tactical or Chaos Space Marines. Let's look at the Devil Dog's Melter Cannon next. That's 24-inch range, assault D3, strength 8, AP -4, damage D6, and because it is a Melter Cannon it has the usual special rule, meaning that if you fire within half range, so 12 inches, it will have 2d6 pick the highest for number of damage, which averages out to 4.5 rather than the 3.5 you'd usually get for firing out of this range. The fact that it's assault rather than heavy is incredibly handy. It means that you'll never be suffering penalties for moving and shooting, so this thing can actually use its full 12-inch mobility to good effect, and you even have the possibility of advancing and shooting if you really want to, though obviously this will hamper your damage output. The Devil Dog will do around 2.3 damage on average to your standard vehicle target, that's a toughness 7 3 up save vehicle, or around 3 damage if it's within melter range. Finally we have the Bane Wolf's Chem Cannon, which is cheaper, but I'm afraid it's cheaper for a reason. The Chem Cannon has an 8-inch range, it's heavy D6 but auto hits its target, it wounds non-vehicles on a 2 up and vehicles on a 6 up. It has AP -3 and damage 1. So I'd say the biggest problem for me with this guy is its range. Only 8-inch range means that you'll have to get right up in the enemy's grill to be able to fire it, making it a lot more susceptible to the charging and locking up problems that we talked about with the Hellhound. It's worse than the Hellhound against hordes, only killing 3 guardsmen compared with the Hellhound's average 5, but a little better against tactical marines, but only very slightly, and that's assuming that you do get in range to fire it in the first place, which this thing will find a lot harder to do than the Hellhound will. It does have a bit of a niche when targeting high toughness things that aren't vehicles, but even then it's only going to do something like 2 or 3 wounds to them, and most high toughness targets have multi-wounds, so it's still not going to be particularly effective. This is all slightly mitigated by it being fairly cheap though. It is 88 points with the heavy bolter, compared with the Hellhound's 101 points, so that is a significant advantage. You could use this thing as a way to get more armoured wounds on the table, and disrupt and distract the enemy as they advance. Aside from the main turret, all of the models can replace their heavy bolter with a heavy flamer, and I'm kind of in two minds about this. It certainly has good synergy with the Bane Wolf's weapon as it has the same range, but with the Hellhound it means that you're going to want to be getting really close to the enemy and not use your Inferno Cannon's long range. As fun as it might be for having the 3d6 flamer shots coming out of your tank, it does also cost 6 points more than the heavy bolter, and the heavy bolter is going to be more useful, at least in some circumstances, while it advances, and won't make you have to position your tank in a bad position. I think competitively I'd probably stick with the heavy bolter for the Hellhound, and particularly so if you're running Talon to negate its moving and shooting penalty. This is personal preference though, and it does have good synergy being another short-ranged, auto-hitting weapon, so if you want to have a full flamer Hellhound then certainly go for it. The Hellhounds, like most of the Guard motorball, can take options from the vehicle equipment list. It can take a heavy stubber or storm bolter. I would recommend the storm bolter for these guys, as they're going to be getting a lot closer to the enemy to get into their threat range, and as they'll be moving all the time, it's better to have a rapid fire weapon than a heavy weapon on these. I'd certainly take it for 2 points for an extra 2 to 4 shots per turn. I personally wouldn't bother with hunter-killer missiles. The tanks are going to be moving, so they'll have bad ballistic skill for using these things. I also wouldn't bother with dozer blades or auger arrays, but track guards can certainly have a decent appeal on a Hellhound. For 5 points, being able to safeguard your movement characteristic is pretty important, because having short range means that you'll be able to still get this thing into threat range, even when it's on its last wound. This, coupled with the fact that it has auto-hitting weapons, means that your tank will be fully operational right until the moment it actually goes down in flames. For 5 points, I think that they're a little bit take or leave as an option. You can get by just fine without them the vast majority of the time, but once in every few games, they might well make an important difference. So I could happily go either way on them. The Hellhounds have a slightly different explode special rule, in that the actual Hellhound itself, not the Bane Wolf or the Devil Dog, will explode on a 4+ rather than a 6+. This is definitely something to consider when you're positioning your Hellhound. It means that you don't want it to be right in the very centre of your formations, just in case the opponent blows this up quite early, and it showers your entire battle line in mortal wounds. This does give you a little bit more of an incentive to get your Hellhound right up into the face of the enemy, because if they do wind up killing it, you might be able to give all of the units around them a bath in promethium. If it is in a particularly advantageous position and you think your Hellhound is likely to go down, it's often worth saving a command reroll to make sure you reroll the explodes result, to give yourself the maximum chance of sending out some mortal wounds your opponent's way. If this explodes in the right position, it could be really devastating. Having 5 or 6 auto-hitting mortal wound attacks really is no joke at all, and it could potentially even swing whole games. As well as explodes, you also have smoke launchers, which could be handy as you advance up the board to try and get those short-ranged weapons in range. It might be worth doing if you don't really need the extra heavy bolter or storm bolter shots as you move up. So smoke launchers might see more use here than they might on some of the other Guard motor vehicles. So overall, the Hellhound, Bane Wolf and Devil Dog are all generally quite short-ranged, fast support tanks for the Imperial Guard. They don't have the most spectacular damage output in the world, but they are incredibly reliable, and particularly the auto-hitting versions will be very dangerous until they are finally destroyed. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we can get more out of them from the Guard Codex. Firstly, if we look at regiments, Chan is pretty much the go-to for these guys. Rerolling 1d6 every time you shoot a flamer weapon is really handy. It's equivalent to around about a 20% damage buff on a heavy flamer or Bane Wolf's Chem Cannon, and only a little bit less on your Hellhound's Inferno Cannon, so it really does soup them up to be as damaging as they can be. Valhallan isn't a bad shout for Hellhounds either. We mentioned why track guards are so strong, and Valhallan could be another way to keep your Hellhound's mobility high. even as it takes damage. Talon could be handy for the secondary armaments, particularly heavy bolters and heavy stubbers, keeping them accurate on the move, but obviously the main weapons on any of these won't get anything out of being Talon. Steel Legion will make them a little bit more resistant to AP-1 fire, and the Mordian trait's going to be mostly useless on the auto-hitting varieties, but could help amp up the Overwatch a bit of that Devil Dog. In terms of character support, these guys are usually quite happy to operate fairly independently. I certainly wouldn't cluster too many characters up round a Hellhound, just in case it does go boom and damages a lot of them. That being said, the Devil Dog could potentially use reroll ones from Harker or Yarrick. Any of them could be repaired by a Tech Priest Engineer, and you could potentially use an Astropath or Primaris Psyker to give them a 2-up save and -1 to hit, which could really be quite valuable on a forward unit that's likely to be getting right in the face of the enemy and taking heavy firepower. In terms of stratagems, as these guys might well be getting into close combat due to their forward nature, crush them could sometimes be helpful to wipe out the last infantryman in a squad that was tying them up, allowing them to fight next turn. Jury rigging could potentially repair them, might be particularly handy if you're trying to get into the next bracket for a Devil Dog, for example, to make it hit better. Defensive gunners to hit more accurately in Overwatch could help out a Devil Dog, although the others are pretty happy without it. And Vengeance for Cadia could allow you to reroll hits and wounds if you are against Chaos. So how would I actually run these guys on the battlefield then? Out of the three, I much prefer the Hellhound over the other two variants. That Inferno Cannon's going to do at least some damage to pretty much any target. It has a decent range, a nice auto-hitting ability, and sometimes you can be clever with that high chance of explosion, giving you the chance to blow up a lot of enemy forces. I'd personally run the Heavy Bolter and the Storm Bolter with it, although I can see why some people might want to run the Heavy Flamer, and I'd be absolutely happy to either take or leave off the track guards. I think they're quite a well-balanced upgrade on this tank for the points for the utility they provide. I'm not such a big fan of the Bane Wolf just because of that short range making it very inflexible about how you can play it. I'd much rather have a bit more range on my anti-heavy infantry firepower. I'd be a lot more looking for things like Lehman Russ Executioners or infantry mounted plasma weapons to fill that niche, as they just do it a bit better with their damage to weapons. As for the Devil Dog, I just find its damage output is a little bit underwhelming. I think that melter weapons in general are a bit overcosted, throughout 40k at the moment, and unfortunately this guy isn't really any exception. If you compare him with a Basilisk, he will do virtually the same amount of damage on average against his prime targets, and the Basilisk doesn't have to be played inflexibly right up at the front. You can sit that back an absolute mile away, and they have a lot of synergy and other buffs. So as the two do basically the same damage output for a very similar points cost, I probably wouldn't be running Devil Dogs while Basilisks exist. If you're looking for a tank to more fill their role of short-ranged anti-tank murder, then look no further than the Lehman Russ Demolisher. Its Demolisher Cannon will do on average 2 to 3 times the damage of that Melter Cannon, for just 35 more points than the Devil Dog is, and it's also a lot more durable with toughness 8. So if I were to take an actual Hellhound with the Inferno Cannon, how would I use it in game? I think that the Hellhound can be quite a useful tank to deploy on the flanks of your forces, as it has good movement, can skirmish quite well, and might match up quite well against other enemy skirmish units, like infantry trying to get onto objectives. Putting it on the flanks away from your main force also reduces the chance that your explosion is going to detonate all over your important units, which definitely is a weakness of the tank. I typically try and hover at about 16-inch range, meaning that you're not that easy to charge while still pumping out the damage output. If you can, it's probably best to try not to position yourself anywhere near line of sight blocking cover to prevent your opponent from charging you from out of line of sight. In any game where you're using vehicles that can't all get cover saves, it might well be worth using prepared positions if you go second, as a 2-up save can be a real pain to chew through when there's a lot of enemy vehicles on the other side of the table. The Hellhound isn't typically ever going to be massively overwhelming with its damage output, but it can be used quite well as a sort of screening and area denial unit to really make an opponent think twice about whether he wants to put a unit in that area of the board, and it's quite handy to have some armour options to do this if you are thinking about running a mainly mech army, as the more vehicles that you put on the table, the more durability you're going to have against anti-tank weapons due to them having too many targets to cope with. If and when your Hellhound is looking like it's on its last legs, a clever move that I've done before is that you can charge it deliberately into an enemy unit that you know is going to kill it in the fight phase, and then save a command reroll to reroll that explodes result, and hopefully shower that unit and all other enemy units nearby in mortal wounds. Typically it's not always going to be worth getting your tank deliberately killed, but if you can get enough enemy units within that 6-inch bubble for the explodes, it could be especially deadly, and it's a lot easier to do this in your turn when you're moving the tank and charging the tank, as opposed to hoping your opponent's going to put enough units within 6 inches to make that explosion worthwhile. So how does the Hellhound shape up against the competition? Firstly, we have the Lehman Russ Punisher, which is also quite good at killing infantry. The Punisher is now 145 points as of chapter approved, so it is significantly more expensive than the Hellhound, and will be a little bit less durable point for point despite that toughness 8. In general, it will do a little bit better against light infantry than the Hellhound will, on a point for point basis, but is pretty similar against medium infantry. The other main advantage of the Punisher is that it has longer range, which is certainly a positive. I think that the two are quite well balanced, to be honest, and there's room for both in the Guard army. Another competitor is the Artemia pattern Hellhound, which is a Forge World unit that I've used in the past. The Artemia has some pros and cons, including a very devastating explosion, where the enemy units within 6 inches take d6 mortal wounds rather than d3, making that explodes charge strategy absolutely devastating in the right circumstances. This guy's a little bit more tailored to taking out heavy infantry, so 2-wound infantry and things, compared with the Hellhound. In general, I think that the Hellhound is a little bit more useful and versatile when taking down most targets, but we might cover the Artemia pattern at some point in a later video. So overall, I think that the Hellhound is perfectly viable as part of a Guard army. It's a good workhorse battle line unit that can both give and take a decent punch, and is really disruptive for the opponent's force to deal with. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, and feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more Imperial Guard videos like this every couple of days. Feel free to support my Patreon page if you'd like to help keep the channel doing what it's doing, as making all of these tactics videos does take quite a bit of time. Thanks for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys in the next episode.